So then we get down to those awkward tests that we get for anything other than just token testing and proving that everything's green even though you're not doing anything. This is one of the biggest issues that I've seen in teams I've worked with recently, and they write all their tests. They complain because, again, this is taking too long. We've written the code. Why should we now bother figuring out what our code does so that we can write a test? And that sentence alone terrifies me because, where did the specs disappear in your tests? And when they do this, changing code then becomes a nightmare because you don't know what's going to happen with those tests. I have seen a couple of different ways of this goes. One time, I needed to change some functionality. We realized that we weren't doing what we should be doing for something, so we actually wanted the outcome to be different. I wanted to run a little test of my own, so I completely changed what this function did. And then I ran the tests, and everything was green, and that kind of terrified me just a lot. Then I did another one. We had something that needed changing for performance, but the functionality didn't change at all. I did my manual test before and my manual test after, and it was exactly the same. And then I ran the unit tests, and oh my god, it was just a sea of red, because the only thing that was tested, nothing to do with the functionality, am I making HTML calls at the time where I think I'm making HTML calls in the middle of this private service down at the bottom of a function. It was evil. And I'm sure that, I'm seeing smiles in the audience, so I'm guessing that this is a known thing across the board. And to do with that last one, I want to do a little story, something that actually happened in my current job a few years ago. One of my colleagues went and saw Ian Cooper's talk, TDD, Where Did It All Go Wrong? And I can recommend watching it. We're going to have resources for this at some point. And his takeaway of that talk was we shouldn't be doing any unit tests. The only thing that we should be doing is API tests from outside of our service because that's the only thing that counts. If you've got a simple service, honestly, I'm going to go for this, that's fine. But how many of us work on simple code? I work in finance code, and I can tell you none of our APIs are that simple. We have an amount of translations that we need to do from what the user has to what we have to what the mortgage data network has in the back end, which is a quagmire in its own thing. So let's say, for simplicity's sake, I've got an API and it's using 3 translators, and each one of those has 5 rules in it. So in my API, I now have tests for those 5, multiplied by those 5, multiplied by those 5. It's too early in the morning, I'm not doing the math, it's a lot. I don't only have one API. I've got an API on this side, and that has 2 translators in it. So this one needs 5 times 5, that's 25. I can do that, but I know it's wrong, because you don't do 5 times 5 to get the amount. It's not pragmatic. You can't do this. You can't possibly have hundreds and hundreds of tests, because the moment you need to change something, you're going to have that sea of red. You're going to have to do so many changes, it's impossible. So in 2022, I was lucky enough to speak at NDC Oslo, and Ian Cooper was there. So I went and had a chat with him, explained what I was talking about with my colleague, and said, is this what you meant? And do you have any thoughts or ideas about, our situation? What should we be doing here? And thankfully, the first thing he said is pragmatism, which is nice, very important in a lot of IT. Just be pragmatic in what you're doing. And he told me to think of the testing as a gear stick method. So you're cruising in your car. I'm a petrol head, so this works for me. If you're going on a nice flat motorway, you want to be in top gear. That's your simple APIs. But occasionally you'll hit a hill and you'll need to change down a gear, especially in older cars. And that's where you get to these translation layers. It's like, it's not possible to do hundreds and hundreds of tests for just one API. So we're going to change down a gear, go that a little bit deeper, and we're going to test the things at a lower level. Now, it's really important. We still need to do API tests. But the customer has changed. The customer is no longer outside of the service. The customer is now the developer that's using these translations. You don't make your tests access internals. You don't make private fields internal or, please don't, public, just so that you can see what's going on in the middle of something. You have an input and an output, and that's what you need to be testing. And once you've done this, of course, make sure that you put it in your pipeline. It sounds so obvious, but I've been in so many places where actually it didn't happen when it should do. You've now got these functional tests, and if you write them correctly, they're really cool, because I can now see what my code is supposed to do from my tests. It's no longer a setup like this where you're just thinking, what the beep is going on here? You've got things that you can read. And every time you do a deploy, now and in the future, these get ran, they should be reasonably quickly, and you kind of know that things are going to work in the way that they want to work. You don't have to do those functional checks manually.
Yeah.
And that means that the testers don't have to do those functional checks manually. And then the next step, which thankfully is starting to change a lot more, is once you get into production, you wrote the code, you own the code. Make sure that you keep an eye on it, make sure you know what it's doing, and make sure you've got an observable system. It's not easy, but we're doing it more and more now. And keep an eye out for things that go wrong so that you can spot issues before your users do.
Right, so making tests for these, writing the automated functional tests from the outside in so that if it breaks, then you can fix it. If the tester shares ahead of time what they'll be looking for, the developers can plan to monitor and log that information so that the team can track usage, performance, and error handling, because once again, failing gracefully is important. The other thing that this helps with is things like flaky tests, because when I'm writing automated tests and a locator changes, God forbid, nothing's really changing with the functionality side, but my test is going to break because that locator can't be found anymore. So things like that, communicating the changes between roles is really important.
Those flaky tests are a nightmare. Flaky tests also really teach developers that if a test breaks, you can kind of ignore it and just run the pipeline again and keep your fingers crossed it's going to go. It wastes so much time. So, another story time. I like stories. Real life example of how this happened to me a few years ago. I started a new job, and my initial thing that I had to do was help one of the teams change. They were having issues. And when I went and observed, and I didn't interact, I just kind of stood a distance back and watched them for a week before I did anything. And the first thing I saw was the tester was absolutely drowning in work. The tester had a tester backlog. It was separate to the team's backlog because there was so much stuff on it. I really don't know how he kept his stress in check. I would have had burnout in that situation. Developers, meanwhile, were just busy piling on more and more finished work. They were told that they had to keep development up because we need features, 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 which of course translates into code, code, code. And this led to some serious issues. Constant arguments, the us and them, yeah, that. It's the things I witnessed in that team, it's about the hardest I've ever had to deal with. Developers never quite knew when things were going to be tested. They got constant interruptions from things that they were doing 3-4 weeks ago, which meant you really had to go back in time, and there's lots of research, and it was just slowing everything down. The tester wanted to implement automated testing. He was really interested in this, but he couldn't do it. He also couldn't do exploratory testing, so who knows what was being missed in this process. All he was doing was spec testing, 8 hours a day, 4 days a week, which was his entire hours. So the first thing I did was just try to talk them and say, hey, why don't you guys work together a little bit more? Yeah, that didn't work. That didn't work in the slightest. I was, first of all, ignored, and then there was the issue of management, because they both had the same perception. Management didn't want them to work together. They just wanted to get this backlog sorted, and one computer, 2 people, how can that possibly be productive? So they had this feeling in their head. Thankfully, I was giving a little bit of authority to change what I felt needed to be changed. So I introduced a WIP limit for them. and I said, well, you've got about 4 people on the team, so you can have 2 stories in progress at one time per developer. I didn't want to go too over the top. And it triggered. By the time I finished that sentence, no more development work could start. And the developers complained. In fact, for 2 days, the developers sat on their butt and complained because, come on, we're now just waiting for the tester. What are we supposed to be doing here? I was like, have you tried speaking to the tester? Have you tried finding out what there is that you can do to help the tester? And it's like, the point is that you need to talk to each other here. And it actually took a big discussion. This was not a simple chat. This was the developers, the tester, me, in a room having a somewhat heightened discussion about how to go forward. But at the end of it, they started to work. They worked with the tester at his machine, and it had 2 instant impacts. The developer started to see what the tester was doing, and there was a few light bulb moments, and oh, right. And more than that, the tester found a bug. They were on the same machine. They went tappy, 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 tappy. The bug was fixed. What was taking 3-4 weeks before was now taking about an hour. The backlog started to get reduced, and by the time that they could actually start developing again, they'd found their new way of working, and I tried to be as hands-off as possible. I didn't want to prescribe things. I wanted them to find what worked for them. And once they started working in their regular flow, they started doing this again. And the tester actually came and sat with the developers sometimes when they were coding, so the tester could see what the developers were doing too. And you got this 2-way flow of information that really helped them. And it meant that things started to disappear from our test machine and move on to, where users could have it, those legendary beings that actually use our code.
Right. And something that I also wanted to mention is while we're working together, it's really important that, like test automation code, often gets split into its own area. Even though we're working in the same code base, I feel like it's really important to have any code that you're writing, whether it's tests, whether it's the actual functionality, it all needs to be together in one source of truth so that you're not going over here for the automation and over here for the functionality.
Absolutely. And why should I care? Which is something else. Even after going through this, I've still had other people from the outside looking in going, it's not going to work for my team. It's going to be effort for my team. Why should I care? And you know what? It is work. It is seriously hard work. This doesn't happen overnight. It's change. And we're human. And as much as we like to say, we're tech, tech moves fast, we change with it. We like using new tech, but we don't like changing ourselves. Humans have this thing. Humans really prefer pain that they've had long-term rather than a short-term pain of change, which is going to improve it. I don't know how that came to be evolutionarily useful, but it's what we do. So given all that, why should we do it? And let's start with better software quality. Who doesn't want to give our users something that works, and not only works, but actually does what they want it to do and what they need it to do? Who doesn't want to be proud to leave at the end of the day thinking, I built that and it's awesome? Working this way means there's less chance of deploying something and having the user go, well, yeah, that looks spangly, but what's it supposed to do for me? And just ignoring it.
Yeah, and then along with that, from the better software quality obviously means better software overall. It's not just better tested software, but more usable software. Because when we talk about testing in this way, we intrinsically talk about how we're solving the problems as well. Because there's a million ways to solve a problem. And the one that you choose may or may not be the best one that covers all of the use cases. But these discussions can trigger great conversations about how to best solve the actual user's problems.
How many times you've heard the phrase, that's just what I asked for, but not what I want? Mm. And again, that team cohesion. I'm a developer. I like sitting down and getting into my concentration zone and doing stuff, but I also love working with the team and having that absolute team feeling that we are building something together and that we can bounce, we know what each other's kind of going to think and say, and we can change stuff at the right time to mean that we can do the right things. And when we not throw it over the wall to the tester, but give it to the tester and say, here, what do you think? We can do that, and, there's less chance of somebody coming back and complaining to us about it.
And by doing all of this, we can ensure that we're spending our time valuably as well. Productivity, the act of doing something, isn't really something that we should be aiming for, just keeping busy. You can be productive bashing away at the keyboard, spending hours, days, weeks making the most perfect software in the world.
But if you're not building the right thing, then what are you doing? If you're not building it in the right way, then you're going to feel the pain later. So productivity, I feel, is the wrong thing, like Karen says. Instead, we should be focusing and ensuring that you're building the right thing in the right way. Don't use that spangly technology just because it's spangly technology. Don't not use that spangly technology because it's not what you normally use. There's the balance point here that you've got to find to make sure that you can change it and use it in the future, it's built for the right target group, and people are going to be happy. That way you can be effective rather than productive. And of course, this also extends to that testing that we were talking about earlier. No longer just fake tests that pretend to call a load of different APIs so that you get that nice 100% green bar in SonarQube. Yeah. I hate the aim of, we must have 100% tests. Like, no, we must have tests that we can trust. We've now got real functional tests that test what we expect to be done in the real world and check that what shouldn't be done doesn't make things go boom in a bad way. And we can do this much easier now because we've been involved right at the start. So no more there's, how am I supposed to write the test? I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing. You've been involved in the start. You can write those tests and then you can build the code to go with it. I heard a wonderful phrase from, I think, G. Paul Hill on Twitter. I love it. Whenever somebody says to him, I can't write tests because I don't know what code I'm supposed to be writing, his answer is, well, Jesus, what code are you writing then?
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I'm a little bit selfish when it comes to these conversations because my favorite part of testing is the exploration. I love coming up with personas, taking tours of the software that you're creating, because something that fulfills me is making sure that the software that you build can be accessed by the widest number of users. Because I know that you're working really hard on this functionality, and I want it to be widely used. So it gives me more time to explore the system for the unknowns. It also is cheaper to find bugs sooner than spending resources and paying people for time wasted, which makes the business people really happy. Also, more meaningful bugs can be discovered. Instead of just finding the basic stuff where the acceptance criteria is not being met, I can find things like security issues, accessibility issues, observability issues, like where something's going wrong, something's failing, and we can't pinpoint where. And then something, just a tiny little plug for the FAST method of software testing, is that we're really good at finding the risks that have to do with the known unknowns. But something that goes with exploratory testing is finding the unknown unknowns, the stuff that we have no idea exists as a risk. We have to do the exploration to find those pieces so that we can mitigate those in the future.
And I just want to jump in here a little bit on the fly, because this has just triggered me again from Dean's talk yesterday on UX. Seriously, if he's talking later on today again, go and see it, because he's awesome. The exploratory tests that a lot of developers go, yeah, but who's going to use it like that? Seriously, sit in on some user testing, because watching users use this is completely idiot-proof, nobody is ever going to get this wrong. and going, what the hell are they pressing that button for? Why would you possibly do that? No, this testing, it makes sense because, wow, how some people use software.
Yeah.
So, yeah, something that all of this has in common, and I think the takeaway that I really want to give to you is to improve the life between you and your tester. Talk to each other. Communication is key. Also, try and talk to your product owner and business analyst. If you have the chance, it's not always possible. I'm in a B2B company, so I don't get to speak to my users, and I hate that because their managers are only interested in budget. They're not interested in making their users' lives easier more than often. So if you get the chance, speak to your users. And if you don't get to deploy your software yourself, if you still have an ops team that takes it and runs everything and doesn't let you near it, talk to them as well and get them involved as early as possible, because they're going to give you infrastructure issues that you weren't thinking about. And if you can solve those at the beginning, like it takes 6 months to order a server sometimes if you're not in the cloud, then you can get that process running at the right time, so hopefully it's not too much of a delay at the point where you want to go live. Work together. Make sure that you are building software together, and make sure you're working in the same direction to make something awesome, rather than pulling against each other and just making life harder. And to the developers out here, I have been on Tester, Twitter, and Blue Sky since the start of lockdown, because Reverse Casual Friday, I like dresses. And I felt really out of place because I was a developer in the tester world. I was the interloper, the cuckoo. But they're really nice people, and they welcomed me, and I've made a lot of friends in that community now, and it's just awesome. So speak to these people. They're not as scary as they look.
Yes, please, I promise. Because testers have to be the glue sometimes that kind of fill in the gaps on teams. We wear a lot of hats so that when there's an issue, we know we can pinpoint the person that can solve that issue for us. So we have to be kind of chameleons, kind of with our hands in every single different jar, which also means people skills. Cue the horror. I know we hate that, but I think the most underrated skills in software development have to do with the soft skills, the communication skills, and especially with giving feedback. So since we as testers are relied on to fill in the gaps, I'm also not saying this is a great thing. It's actually kind of problematic that testers have to do this, but I've got a whole talk coming on this later. But in the meantime, I promise that I, as a tester, will use my many hats to try to build bridges between the roles instead of setting them on fire.
And with that, we've reached the end of the journey here. I've been Stacey Cashmore.
Karen Todd.
And yeah, thanks for listening. And one thing that we'd like to invite you to do is we're here at a conference with a whole rate track. Practice, talk to people, say hello, converse, and enjoy the rest of the conference. And we have about 5 minutes, I believe, so if there is any questions, we have some time.
Yeah, and if you have something that you've been struggling with that maybe you don't want to talk about the whole situation in front of everybody else, please come and find us through the rest of the conference. I'd like to give you some personalized advice.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Can you, or rather, how can you implement this outside of just developers and testers?
Okay, so the question is, how can you implement this outside of developers and testers? In my experience, this takes pain to get it working in the first place, but it's also the willingness of the developer and the willingness of the business. And the organization has a huge impact. I think one of the best ways I've seen it working, and that thankfully spread throughout the company afterwards, I was building an execution-only mortgage flow. which, for those that don't know, it means you can get a mortgage without speaking to a mortgage advisor. And when the company did this, we're about 300-400 people, well-established company. We were no longer a startup, although we like to pretend that we were. But this team was taken out of the main building and put into a separate building in rooms hired explicitly for our team, and we worked as a startup, just with 6-7 people. And that meant that we had to be involved. So if you can get that kind of interaction from the start, as developers, me and the other 2 developers on the team, we were actually looking at the wireframes with the UI designer and the product owner, and we were saying, yeah, but if we're using the site, that would really annoy us. And and we joined left and right in this flow, and thankfully the company saw the benefits and the fantastic product that it produced, and they wanted to spread it to the others. It's really not easy. I'm struggling in my current company because one of the people there thinks that they're a designer, and they've got all these wonderful screens. It's like, well, why are you asking questions? I did this years ago. And it's like, yeah, you did this years ago. We're building it now, and it's slowly moving, but it just kind of takes that persistence. And you need to have developers that want to do this too.
Yeah.
I've never had an issue with a tester in this. I don't know if you've got a different story there.
Well, I sometimes have trouble getting people to buy into the testing that I'm doing, the whys of what I'm doing. So my favorite thing to do is to actually host something like a bug bash, where I get product people, BAs, all these, developers who built the system in the same room, and then set them loose on the system that's been built. So one person has an assumption that something is supposed to work this way, while another person is like, okay, well, it's supposed to work this way. And that starts the discussion between them and bridges the gap between the assumptions so that we are all under the same umbrella, kind of like example mapping again, just starting these conversations.
Yeah, and the last one that I've just remembered, because it's like 20 years ago that I first encountered it. 24 years ago, 25 years ago I first encountered it. Wow, I'm old.
It's okay.
I started at a large customer care and billing company. They made software for the huge cable and satellite companies around the world. And what they did with their developers when they started, for about a month and a half, I didn't see the code. I was put in the test team for 2 weeks, and I was given test scripts, and I had to go through and find the tests. I was terrified because in those 2 weeks, I logged something like 650 bugs, and I apologized to the testing manager. And the testing manager said, no, this is awesome because we all know those bugs are there, but that's just how it works, so we ignore them. When you get somebody new on this, it's like, whoa, and they log everything, and it really helps them clean things up. And it helps you learn the people, to meet the people, and how to use the software as well. And the other thing they did for us, they gave us the same training that they give customers. So that was 3 weeks in a classroom, from setting up initial, getting ready, installing, all of the setup options that you can do, right down to when you call the cable company, this is what the people on the phone are doing. And that, again, that fostered that same kind of, we want to talk to these people and we want to make sure that we're in the same room because everybody has the same idea of what they're doing.
Can I ask a quick question of you all? Is it okay if Stacy and I take a selfie with you? Awesome. I don't get to come to developer conferences very often, so I have to prove to my fellow testers that I did this.
Okay, arms in the air, big chair.
Love it. Thank you. Appreciate you.
And with that, we're out of time. Like Karen said, if there's anything that you don't feel comfortable saying, like in the big room, we're going to be around. Come and find us. We're quite happy to chat. Thank you so much for your attention.
I have trinkets.
Oh yeah, and get bracelets.